Welcome back to this fourth installment on the Learning the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. In this episode, I'm going to focus completely and totally on the concept of combat and attacking units. In the previous episode, I looked at how we move our units around the map and all of the details that are related to the movement of those units. And in this particular one, we're going to look at how they fight. Half the game is getting your units into position, and in most of the scenarios, there are strategic objectives that need to be captured. As in this scenario, the crossing Chickamauga Creek, you can see these yellow hexes, and the red hexes there represent variable victory point spots that can be captured. Maneuver is only half the game, so we focused all of episode 3 on how you move these units around the board. And so now it's time. There's going to be a point where maneuver is certainly not enough, and you're going to have to prosecute some kind of battle to force people out of position and to get your own units to take a victory point spot. There are two types of combat in the system. There's marching attacks, which you're actually in the process of moving your units along a road and then interacting with another unit, and combat then ensues. And a core assault, which is where the actual entire division or series of divisions will attack from one hex into an adjacent hex. That requires a bit more planning and organization because that's involving leadership and several other factors. So we're going to see both of those. I'm going to go through both examples of them, and I'm going to review each and all of the die roll modifiers because, in essence, the combat is extremely simple in this series. Both sides are going to roll a die, and you're going to look at the differential between them, where some people get challenged by this, or some people find it particularly difficult to grasp, is that there are quite a few die roll modifiers that you have to look at. So when you are proceeding forward with your units and you're about to engage in combat, you do want to look at all the possible ramifications, not only to the size of the forces, but the type of terrain that you're attacking into, the artillery situation between your units and the opponents, and leadership, and several other modifiers. So we're going to take a look at each of those, and hopefully by the end of this you'll have a pretty good idea of how combat works. Going back to our Great Campaigns of the American Civil War website, the GCACW.com, I've pulled up the standard basic game rules again here, and I'm going to focus this entire episode on the section 7, which is all about combat. Specifically, what I want to focus on in this particular recording is the actual combat itself, the individual methods that you attack. Like I said, the marching versus the core assault, the different combat values that are involved, and the artillery values, and the other die roll modifiers. And we'll probably get as far as the combat results. I will briefly talk about retreats and routes, but I think that deserves an entire recording unto itself. So I'm going to touch on it a bit here, and then we'll devote more time to it a little bit later. Well, let's get started. What do you say? I think the first thing we'll do is we'll take a look at Bragg's stack here with Polk and Cheatham available, and I'm going to demonstrate first an attack on the march. This is the most common attack that happens, and so it's good to understand the mechanics of it, and it's a it's a good first step because, again, as I said, it is the most immediate way that people perform combat within the Great Campaign system. So this is a good one in the crossing Chickamauga Creek scenario here. Essentially, the Confederate unit is just trying to get across. So, as the namesake says, just trying to get into these hexes. If they, in one turn, it's a one-turn scenario, if at the end of the turn they occupy any of these red hexes, then they're going to get 10 victory points. If they occupy any of these yellow hexes, then they get 6 victory points. And they are mutually exclusive, so they can only get the points for one of them, whatever the higher one is that they've achieved. So typically in the scenario, we've got the southern units here that are attempting to make some kind of a beachhead or a breakthrough it down here to the south, or often coming around and flanking around the Union left. In the examples that I'm going to give here first, we'll start using Polk. And as a quick review for last episode, you can remember that the division leader or the corps leader, if he's within a command radius of several units, he could activate a single or multiple units, all within his 3 hex command radius. And so in this case here, we'll go ahead and say Polk would activate Cheatham for a march, and I'd roll the die, and he gets 3, and we add his +2 for being a Confederate leader. That gives him 5 movement points to work with, and that's perfect for this example. So Cheatham would then get the fatigue marker, it's at fatigue level 1, and we would proceed to move him with everybody in tow, Bragg and Polk. Pick him up. We bring him 1 hex along that road, and they've expended 1 movement point. Now they have 4 movement points left over, and the first thing we need to decide is once you've entered that zone of control of an enemy unit, you have to first make that 50-50 choice of do I attack or do I not attack. Your particular playstyle may dictate whether or not you're a more active or aggressive attacker. I tend to play a little more conservatively because each situation is going to be different. In this particular scenario here, the Confederates, the onus is on them to actually get across the creek, so they are going to be more attack oriented. So once they've arrived at this point, we can then naturally assume that the marching unit, Cheatham's unit here, would decide that he is going to attack Palmer. So that first decision's made, and we will go ahead and set this up for a march on the attack. Excuse me, an attack on the march. The first decision you need to make when you are attacking. So we'll pull up our charts here, our handy dandy charts, and we can see right here we have our attack summary. And the attack summary is the amount of movement points you are willing to expend from your current movement allowance to determine what kind of attack you're going to make. So you can see they range from a column of route, essentially they're marching down the road and they're just firing their rifles from the road while in line formation. As you can see that it costs them nothing. However, there is a -3 die roll modifier to it because it is such a disorganized method of attack. To a lesser degree, you have the hasty attack, which you will expend 1 movement point, and that is a -1 die roll modifier. But what you're usually attempting to do is just a normal attack here, and there is no die roll modifier. So if you spend 2 movement points, you can make a normal attack, and you will suffer no penalties for your die roll. But the absolute best thing that you can do is if you have 4 movement points for your infantry to spare, or 8, you can see all of these are double values for cavalry since they are rolling 2d6. You want to try to make it a prepared attack if you can while you're marching, because that gives you a bonus of +1. So in all of these, the situation is obviously going to be dictated by how many movement points you have left to spend. You can see that there is a little special note here for the infantry cost of a column of route, that it only costs 0, but you can't expend 0 if you don't have at least 1 left. So if you already have 0, then you can't make the attack. But in most situations, your best bet is to try to get into position where you have 4 movement points remaining, and you can make that prepared attack. In our example here with Polk and Cheatham, they had 5 movement points and they moved 1 hex, so that leaves them with 4 movement points left over, and that's fortunate enough for them to make a prepared attack on Palmer. So that first decision then is based completely on what type of attack they want to make. And if you take a look up there on the text bar, I'm going to keep a running tally of our die roll modifiers just to give you a pretty good idea of how these work. And I think that's a good way to just kind of keep things detailed, because without a little bit of bookkeeping in front of you, it is possible to get confused about what you're doing. So you can see I've listed here a type of attack is prepared. So we're going to spend those 4 movement points for +1 die roll modifier. and that will use all of his remaining 4 points. Jumping back to our charts here, the next thing we need to look at is the ratio chart between the attacker and the defender. As you can see here, I've highlighted the ratio chart, and it runs from a 1 to 13, so the attacker has a 13th the size of the defender. That is obviously a very bad situation, so you want to avoid that if you can. All the way up to a 14 to 1 in favor of the attacker. Normally what's going to happen is you'll fall into some of these categories: 1 to 1, 2 to 1. Typically, the better you can get here, that's what you're shooting for. And you can see for a 2 to 1, you get a +1. And as the quick memory device for you is whatever the highest value is, you just subtract, or the highest ratio is, of course, all the way up to 14 to 1. You just kind of subtract 1 from that, and that gives you your die roll modifier. So normally, most of your attacks are going to be sort of 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1. And you can get a quick idea of what kind of bonuses you'll get. So this is a die roll modifier. As you can see, as I'm going to add it here to the chart, all of these die rolls are cumulative. So really just becomes a small game of accounting, and I guess that's bothersome to some people that you're constantly running numbers and crunching data and trying to figure out what is optimal. But this is somewhat of a simulation of what battlefield commanders had to do in order to try to make the most of the advantages or disadvantages they had going in their favor. So if we refer back, I'm going to close the chart here for a second, and if we refer back to Polk's versus Palmer, we can see the ratios. We'll take a look. When we compare the two manpowers, expand both of them here, we can see Cheatham's division has a 13 manpower, and Palmer has a 9. So when we do the comparison of 13 to 9, that is very simply a 1 to 1. There is no ratio modifier. So we can add to the top of our list here, our ongoing tally, a +0 for the ratio. And this is just as a side note here, whenever you get forces this size, and we'll take a look at the combat chart in just a moment, whenever you get manpower of 13 or 14, anything really higher than 4, 5, or 6, you're going to start getting casualties that are just due to the very nature of the battle. There's going to be not friendly fire, but if you want to think of it, there's going to be a certain amount of casualties that you take even if you do succeed and win the particular battle. So there are going to be manpower losses on both sides. The optimal situation, of course, is that you inflict more manpower losses on your enemy and also get them to retreat or rout them away. In some of the later titles, and in like Battle of the Clouds here, this takes place in December of 1863, so manpower becomes a premium for the victory point conditions, because in most of the scenarios when the Union forces take a loss, that's worth 2 points per manpower. However, if the Confederate units take a loss of manpower for each point they lose, that's 3 victory points that are taken against them. So it is more advantageous for the Union to score casualties on the Confederate units in most battles. Next up is the concept of the tactical modifiers. That's where we compare the best leadership qualities of both the attacker and the defender, and we look at any net difference between the two values, and then that will be added or subtracted to as another die roll modifier. So we take a look at Polk here, because he is the corps commander and he's traveling along. You always take the highest total value of leadership that is present in a hex. So looking at both of our units here, both Polk and Palmer, we could see that Polk, as the attacker, has his combat value of his leadership tactical modifier of 3, and Palmer has a 2. So that means that when you compare the two, the 3 is a +1 in favor of the attacker. So we would just add that as our next die roll modifier. And we just go ahead and log that, add that to our running total. The next thing we have on my list here are the terrain modifiers. So this is when you're going to look at any particular references to terrain, and of course we'll always go back and refer to our terrain effects charts here for this situation, and pull up the major terrain here. And what this will do is, over in the notes for these, for example, if you were attacking a hill, that it will indicate perhaps some effects on the artillery, or give pluses in defense to particular units that may be occupying them and are defending them. So you always want to come back and check your major terrain and get an idea of what's going to happen. The hexside terrains that we're going to be working with in this particular attack are creeks and minor rivers. You can see that attacking across a minor river is prohibited unless you have a bridge present. So since you do not exert a zone of control across it unless there's a bridge, then the same logic stands to reason that you can't attack unless there's a bridge. In our particular situation here, we can see that Polk, hide the units here very quickly, we can see from attacking across this creek here at the Snow Hill Post Office into the Glass Mill hex, there is a creek present. We can see that what's going to happen is the defending unit is going to get a +1 to his die roll modifier. And just depending on how you want to do the bookkeeping, some people like to give both sides all of their positive pluses for the die roll modifiers. Personally, I like to just go ahead and put everything, do my old algebraic equation, do everything on one side of the equal sign. So I like to either add or subtract just to get them all in relationship to the attacker. That's just a personal preference of mine. You may want to do it differently. In this situation, then we're going to, or the attacker would suffer a -1 to their die roll if we're doing it that way. And we can just put that right up here on our list, like so. So we've added a creek, or we've subtracted that as a die roll modifier. Then you want to look at the artillery values between the two units. And as we pointed out, one of the first ones about this, each division has an intrinsic set of artillery batteries that are attached to it, and that's represented by this small black number here. So you take a look at both of the units, and you're going to make a comparison again, just like we did with the tactical modifier for the leaders. Pulling our chart back up here, and we'll see that what you're going to do in our combat modifiers here, there's an entire little sub-menu here related to artillery. And essentially all you're looking at on this chart is just a comparison of the difference between the attacker and defender, which is going to be the common theme throughout all of our calculations here. And then we're also going to cross-reference it with what type of terrain you're attacking into, and that becomes very important. You can see that for the attacker, attacking into a clear terrain is the most devastating, because once the artillery batteries are set up there, they are going to inflict the heaviest die roll modifiers to the attacker. And as you get into more unfavorable terrain, then artillery plays less of a role. And as you can see here, in the woods and city and mountain and swamps, they aren't even useful. So luckily for Polk, when we look at his situation here, we that he has, fortunately, even though he is at he's got 3 artillery batteries attached to his unit versus Palmer's 4. Luckily, we're attacking into a wooded area here. So because we saw on the chart there that woods have no effect, or artillery does not play a role in that, there is no die roll modifier, then normally what would happen here, because he's at a -1, if he just doing a for instance here, a -1 if he were attacking into a clear terrain, you could see that if the defending unit had at least 2 artillery batteries in his division, that would be a -2 die roll modifier. So that could be quite a game changer here. Artillery is abstracted a bit, and for those of you who may be just watching this as a refresher from older series, this is a change. Once they went to the standard series, there had been different die roll modifiers, or a different calculation for that. All of that has been scrapped in favor of what I'm showing you here in the standard series rules. So for anyone coming back to the system after 15 or 20 years, you're used to individual titles doing doing the calculations a little differently. But I find this to be a very clean, if abstract, system for artillery. But it's a good way to just put everything back into our total die roll tally. So Polk and Cheatham kind of dodged a canister shell, if you want to think of it, and we will add the +0 die roll modifier. Just want to point out, going back to the chart here very quickly, some of these situations have a little asterisk here at rough and rolling. And what that wants you to do is, that's just saying that there is a variability, there is a chance that artillery may or may not be effective. So right before the battle occurs, you would roll a die, and if it's either even or odd, depending on the situation, then you would either get 0 or the -1 or a +1 die roll modifier. The last die roll modifier that you could potentially have, and I'm going to skip this for now just because it is a little bit more advanced, and we'll come back to it either later on in this recording. Most likely I will include it as part of the retreats and routes recording that I'll do next time for number 5. But that's the concept of flanking. That has been abstracted a little bit in this game, and essentially what you're trying to do is attack on multiple fronts. And the more extreme the flanking that you can do, the better the die roll. So it is possible to get anywhere from a +1 all the way up to a +4 die roll modifier in the attacker's favor, should he be able to successfully flank the defending unit. That's one of the advantages. We'll talk a little bit after I go through the 2 different attack types. The advantage of attacking with a march is that a corps commander could activate 2 or 3 units and get them all into a position where they're in a flanking situation around a defender, and then he could proceed with the last division that he may be part of to roll up on a defender and attack from a particular hex side that would then give him the full flank bonus that he needs. So I'm not going to talk about it just yet because that is, like I said, a little more advanced. But just for this simple attack, we've gone through each of the die roll modifiers. We can see that we have +1, 2 +1s, and a -1, giving us a net net die roll modifier of just +1 for this attack. So you would sit there every time you do a march attack, or when you're preparing assault, you're going to sit there, and this is one of those parts of this game that is a little challenging for new players, and that's what I'm hoping to help you with in this situation. But after 1 or 2 games, you get a few scenarios under your belt, a lot of these die roll modifiers become second nature to you, and you're just rattling them off in your head, and you can kind of do the calculations on the fly. Once all the die roll modifiers have been factored in and tallied up, then it's just a matter of rolling 2 dice. The attacker and defender each throw a d6, and we add and subtract as needed, look at the difference, and then we consult the combat chart. So Polk and Cheatham here have a net die roll modifier of +1. I'm going to roll 2 dice here. The first one, as with the convention we typically use, is going to be our Union number, and the second one will be the Confederate number. And a very successful attack for the Confederates. When we add the +1, we have a 7 for the Confederates, which is a +5 in their favor versus the 2. So now we pull up the combat chart, and we consult, based on the size differences of the 2 units, what the results are going to be. On our charts, I've gone ahead and switched over to the combat chart here, as you see. And just as a reminder, what it does give you all of the individual modifiers and the game-specific modifiers, which are very helpful. So you can kind of use that as just a checklist to make sure that you're covering anything and everything. Some of the ones I didn't talk about, because they don't come up all the time, are attacking in a rain term, looking at attacking from hill to hill, or from lower terrain up into a mountain. The defender in a mountain or hill terrain hex are going to get either +1 or +2, just depending on what's going on here. So you can see some of those are articulated here. Now, if this is your first time looking at this chart, it's very simple. you can see that it is a little counterintuitive than what you might think. The attacker is put over here on the right-hand side, the defender is on the left-hand side. So all you have to do is look down the column for the size of the attacker. In this case, Polk had a combat value of 13, so he's going to be on the 12 to 18 column. And then you just come right down, look at the differential of the die roll, and we can see that here we are at the +5 that he got. He had a 2. The defender had a 2 versus the 7 that Cheatham got. So we would consult that line and that spot right there. And I've highlighted that as just a little mark so we can kind of see. Then we just move right across the row to the defender side, and we'd see he had a 9, and we would then highlight what he got, which is the 2DR there. So when you compare the two, we can see the summary of results down here at the bottom. If you get an E, that just means that he ends his action. Normally what would happen is if you're attacking during a march, if you had movement points left over that were not utilized for the particular type of attack, then you could expend those and continue moving. In this case, it's just saying that he ends the action because it was such a large assault, it just stopped them. However, they have a small a here, which means that they can't advance into the hex once the defender has moved out. And when we move over to the defender side, we can see that he's got a 2, which means he's going to lose 2 manpower right off the top. He's got a large D, which is the most prevalent result here for the combat. And the big D as I call it, is disorganized. That means he's going to gain 3 fatigue levels immediately, and then he's going to, in this case, you have the small r and the large R. Small r just means a simple retreat. The large R, big R, means that is a rout, which is a considerably farther movement away. The forces have been routed off the field. So there's disarray, panic, as they are fleeing for their lives. And both of these situations are modeled. As I said, we're gonna talk about that specifically in episode 5. But just to kind of give you an idea of what happens, sort of a quick capsule review. A rout just means they have to move at least 4 hexes away from the attacking unit as expediently as possible, which means ideally they're trying to stay on roads. And they must do 4. They can go up to 6 hexes away. So we will model that together here right now. Coming back to the actual battlefield here, this is where we would utilize the vassal module. So as we saw, he's going to lose 2 manpower. So I just using my control left brace here to take away 2. And because they're disorganized, that means they're automatically going to flip to disorganized because of the big D. And Palmer is going to get 3 fatigue levels, even though he had exerted none at all. So that's essentially ended their day, but they still have 1 fatigue level that they can expend through the day if they needed to. And Palmer got the rout, which automatically turns them into demoralized. So he'd get the first step. Looking back at the chart here, you can see that a large R is just demoralized step 1. They get the asterisk, that's going to put them at demoralized step 2, which is even more severe. Once they've assigned those, and we can see that nothing occurred to Cheatham at all, they came in unscathed, even though that was a very large force. You would think they would suffer some, but the differential was so great that it didn't matter. And Palmer now has to route away. So normally what happens here, if I had both maps you could see it, but you would have to follow roads. You'd go 1 step, 2 step, 3 steps. I'm going to assume that there's the road coming down here, which there is. 3, 4. He can go up to 6 hexes away. So, and we're going to look at the difference. They actually have a programmed chart for the different types of retreats and routes. Some steps are required. Obviously, you want to stay on roads and avoid zones of controls of the enemy. And then there are some flexibility steps that you can perform. But it is possible for you to inflict more casualties on your opponent just through control of how they have to retreat. So that is one of the strategic elements of this game as you get more advanced in it, is to figure out what is the optimal way to attack someone so that you're not only inflicting damage just from the combat itself, but also during their flight from the battlefield. Once that defending unit has vacated the hex, then the victorious unit may advance into the hex as per the combat chart, and he is ready to end that particular action. He's got nothing else he can do because of the end action. And at this point you would roll initiative, and it would proceed on to the next action step. So that is attacking on the march. It's very simple. I would recommend, as you are learning the system, to just take a little scrap of paper. And there are some nice resources online that I've seen on Board Game Geek where they have some little Excel spreadsheets and little worksheets that you can print out just to kind of keep track of your things. When I'm sitting there, I often have my fingers, just like I was in second grade, sitting there going +1, -1, just adding and subtracting, just so I keep track of things myself. But once you get the hang of it, it is second nature. You'll be able to visualize just from moving your units around what is mathematically a better or worse attack to make. So this first example, as you can see, just attacking on the march. I'm going to move on now talking about the concept of assaulting from one hex to an adjacent. This was actually a very fortuitous example with that great success by Polk and Cheatham driving the Palmer's forces away, because what that's done, we're going to jump forward in time here a little bit as I give you the assault example. We're going to assume that Bragg and Polk and Cheatham did occupy that space in the woods where Palmer had fled from. And in a subsequent action now, let's say he won the initiative again, we could attempt to, instead of marching to attack, we could opt to make a choice by a division or series of divisions, provided that they have a core leader in their hex. He can then activate all the units. They will increase the fatigue level, and they will make an attempt to assault an enemy hex that is adjacent. So in this situation here, Polk wakes up the next morning and he issues an order to Cheatham and says, I want you to assault Crittenden and Van Cleve there in the adjacent hex at 3632. So just by making that choice alone, the player who is the attacker would increase the fatigue level, which I've done. We went from fatigue level 1 to 2. But the wrinkle in this was going to work exactly the same mechanically from a gameplay standpoint as attacking on the march. We're going to have the same modifiers, leadership, artillery, terrain. The only thing we won't have is the attack type, because it's presumed that should the assault automatically proceed, that's on the same level as a prepared attack. So you're going to get a +1 just for the nature of the assault. But where this is a little different is we see here on Polk's counter, not only do we have the leadership, but we also have this 5 here for him. That is his overall assault capability. Obviously, you want leaders with a higher number, because what we're going to have to do first to ensure that the assault actually even takes place is we have to roll a d6 and compare it to that number. Now, if you're attacking in this situation here, or if I'm assaulting rather with one division, it's not a big deal. However, there are some chances. There's always a 16% chance. It's a 1 in 1d6 for you statisticians out there, that the assault will fail just before it even gets off the ground. So I'm going to roll this d6 here, and if I get a 6, then what that means is it fails completely, and it does not even proceed. So he rolls a 3. That's good. So the attack is going to proceed. What I will then do is take the number that I rolled, and subtract it from whatever his leadership number is. In this case, he's got a 5, so I'd subtract that 3 from it. That means the resulting 2 is the number of divisions within that hex that could participate in the actual assault. Again, in this situation, it does not make a difference because I only had one division. But if I had, in some games where I have an entire corps stacked together, that's very common in your with the Union, where you'll have 5 or 6 corps all stacked together in one hex, it becomes tricky. It becomes a challenge to make sure that you can actually get the assault off the ground with all the units participating that you want. And from this point forward, now that we know that the assault is going to take place, I was guaranteed at least 2 divisions. I only have 1 in there. I could then, at this next step, this is a sub part, and I'm actually going to talk about this here. Let me, just for example here, I'm going to bring Hindman up. Let's just say that his division was occupying that hex as well. After you've been guaranteed the right to proceed with your assault, you now have a next step on the decision tree before you actually complete all the die roll modifiers. And that is to call for a grand assault. And all this is saying is a regular assault is just proceeding from one particular hex to another. However, if your division or the origin of the assault is within 3 hexes of an army leader, as we are here with Bragg, then it is possible to request a grand assault. And the point of that is to bring in additional hexes to increase your manpower, to increase your overall artillery capability. And then now you have multiple hexes, or as a fallback on, let's say you just happen to roll poorly on your artillery roll. Let's say that for whatever reason Polk has he's got 3 divisions that are from multiple leaders or multiple divisions, so we've got Walker in there. It is possible that you could then call for a grand assault just to actually get all of the various and sundry divisions from different leaders to participate in a single assault. That's really the only way you can do that. But more often than not, it's used to get multiple hexes participating in the same assault. And again, that's a little more advanced. We'll talk about that in the next recording. I will kind of pick up on some of the odds and ends of combat, but just to expedite things here, essentially what you would do is, if you make that decision, I would roll another d6, and in this case, I rolled a 6, just like previously with the assault. A 6 is an automatic failure, so Bragg says, no way, I'm not allowing any other divisions, you go at it alone. But normally what would happen is, you would compare that number, you'd subtract it from Bragg, or whomever the army leader is. You can see Rosecrans is his counterpart across the way there. And obviously the lower the number is really what you want. You subtract that number, and that gives you more. In this case, the resulting number represents the number of additional hexes, not divisions, but actual hexes that can participate. So if I had surrounding units all the way around here, they could then join in, and we add all their manpower and all of their artillery together when we start doing our calculations. But in this case, Polk said, hey, can I bring Hindman in? And Bragg said, no, just Cheatham. I feel like I should give you a quiz at this time just to see if you remember all of the die roll modifiers, but we'll go through it again here very quickly one time together, because as I alluded to before, the assault die roll modifiers are exactly the same. You get 4 or 5 individual ones. The only one that's a little different is that you don't have to worry about the type of attack, because it's presumed that since you're assaulting, you're going to get the +1. So let's go ahead and add our numbers up here individually. We get the +1 for the assault. When we compare the 2 combat ratios here between Cheatham and Van Cleve, we can see that Cheatham has a 13 manpower and combat value versus Van Cleve's 8. So that when we compare the 13 to 8 is still just a 1-to-1. So that's a 0 on our die roll modifier. When we compare our 2 tactical modifiers, we can see the Polk is at a 3 And crit did is likewise also at a 3, so that gives us a +0 on the tactical difference between the two of them. Because this is a very simple, straightforward attack between this Woods Hexhide here, which is, in the previous example, had I still had some movement points left over, it would not be possible for me to attack from 37-33 into this crawfish spring, because one of the particular rules about the Woods Hexhide is that you have to start adjacent before you can actually have any combat between the two hexes. So in that situation, we actually had to wait until this particular assault. But there are no streams, no creeks, nothing like that. So there are no terrain modifiers for us. And we'll just add that to our list here. I don't have any flanking modifiers, so I would ignore that for now. But obviously what I'm going to do in the next episode is just try to show you some of the optimal ways that you can get at least a +1 or +2 to your situation. But in this particular one, there is no modifier for flank, and we just move on to the last thing, which is artillery. This is perhaps the most dangerous part of this attack, because Bragg has, in Cheatham's division, he has 3 artillery pieces, or batteries, and Van Cleve is defending also with 3. And in the situation, if you remember back in our combat chart, when you look at the artillery modifiers, it's 3-3, so that is a +0. And he's attacking into clear, which means he's going to get a -2 added to his assault roll. As you can see, I've noted that right up here. So that is probably the most detrimental part of this entire attack, is that he's going in there into the massive cannons right in their face. And that's all the modifiers. So we look at the cumulative amount here. We get the +1 for the assault. Everything else is 0 essentially, and then a -2 for the defending artillery in the clear. So a net on that, I'm going to put there is a net -1, and we would then roll the 2 dice. Again, the Union will be my first, and then Confederate the second number. And disaster. That's about as bad as you can. That's the old 6-1 split. You think bowling has it bad with the 7-10. The 6-1 split here is the worst possible thing that you can see for an attacker defender. In this case, it's made even worse, because that net -1 reduces the split to 0 for the Confederate attacker and 6 for for the Union defender. So we're going to pull up the combat chart to see how devastating this is for a repulsed attack. We remember that Cheatham has a 13, and now we're way down here in the -6. So you can see he's going to suffer 3D and absolutely nothing at all for Van Cleve when we come over here to their 8 spot on the 7-11. So this is just a devastating failure on the part of attack. And for those of you who have ever played with me, you know that this is very common for me. So that is probably the tensest part of the game. This is what gets people knots in their shoulders. And you have to be prepared for this kind of outcome. You can have all the die roll modifiers in the world go in favor, but you can actually get something as horrific as this. And I think this is an excellent way of simulating Burnside's charges across Antietam Creek. They're just going into the face of this devastating fire, and cannon fodder has become a factor. So a 3D, we will go ahead and mark that here. And I will they immediately take fatigue. They take 3D losses there and flip to disorganized. And luckily, they can't lose morale or be retreated or anything like that because they were the attacker. But that is still a significant effect. And as I mentioned earlier, manpower is a key element of victory for Union to inflict casualties. So this is one of those situations where the Confederate player going into this was not necessarily an ill-advised attack, but it is a horrific outcome because he's essentially dug himself into a hole now with victory point losses. Well, I can see by the counter here on my recording that I'm coming up on 45 minutes, and I think this is probably a good stopping point for this evening, for this particular episode anyway. This has demonstrated both the concepts of combat, attacking on the march, and an assault based from one hex to another using the core commanders, and all of the individual die roll mechanics and modifiers involved with it. You've seen a very successful attack and a a desperate failure. So you've seen both ends of the spectrum here in one recording, which I think is quite educational, because then you get an idea of the different play styles involved. Some people play fast and loose with the numbers and they just attack at all costs, and that can be a detriment to their particular strategy. Sometimes tactically that makes sense because you are up against the wall with time, but just keep in mind that when you look at the combat chart here, it is equally devastating for both the attacker and defender. You have to play that balance of how much manpower do I bring in and potentially lose on my own for a slightly successful attack, versus not having enough and just inflicting damage to yourself and being repulsed constantly. So again, that's one of those educational things that you kind of pick up through repeated play and experience. It's hard to just say, for me, to tell you what is good and what is bad, so you just have to do that yourself. I do want to give you one little quick referral. I saved this for last. I do want to show you tonight's web resource to just give you something to chew on here until we look at the next part. As I showed you in the first episode, one of the great resources that I've discovered online is Jay Meyer's site here, Word Game Replays, and he has that online tutorial for the Great Campaign system, but he also has a very good article that's written called The Tricks of the Trade. It's written by Mark Booth about a year or two ago. And essentially, as he was learning the system, he was going through and making notes for himself. He obviously has a great deal of experience with other combat systems and wargame systems. And what he did was put together sort of a monograph here on what he figures are the best strategies for just typical play. And since this ties in so much with combat, I figured this was probably a good time to point this out to you. So you may want to go through this, and that will give you some food for thought as we move forward, especially into the next episode, which is going to talk about retreats, routes, and those concepts of flanking. Hopefully you have found this useful. It can be a little dry, especially when we're talking about die roll modifiers and pluses and minuses and things like that, but my hope is to make it somewhat palatable, at least easy to understand. And I hope I have not driven anyone away from the system. It is an excellent, excellent game, and there's a lot for you to consider. So I hope I will see you back here in episode number 5, and try to get this out very, very soon. Thanks.